Florida is always sold as a symbol of American coastal living. White beaches, busy tourist cities, and an economy that keeps growing from endless tourism. But behind that postcard image, there is another side rarely shown. Some places are slowly losing their main industry. Some live entirely from seasonal tourism, and some stand only a few kilometers from luxury districts, but exist in a very different economic world. In these places, Florida's contrast becomes truly visible, not between states, but between one coastal city and another, where the same ocean does not always bring the same fate. From a distance, West Palm Beach often feels like a perfected Florida postcard. But what is rarely seen from the surface is how sharply this city holds its social contrasts. Residential blocks here are denser, buildings are older, and signs of economic pressure feel much stronger. The city's overall median income is around $73,000, but in several pockets of urban poverty, the reality is far lower, falling into low-income neighborhoods that depend heavily on low-wage service jobs. Certain blocks show higher crime levels than the Palm Beach County average, especially property crime and incidents tied to economic pressure. The pattern is not a city that is entirely dangerous, but one concentrated in certain pockets left behind by development. On the map of South Florida, Homestead looks like a transition point. Before the long road toward the Florida Keys, the city becomes a kind of waiting room between dense metropolitan Miami and the tropical island chain to the south. In reality, Homestead carries noticeable social pressure. Median household income is around $65,000, but rising living costs in Miami-Dade County leave many families on the line between stability and vulnerability. What is interesting is that Homestead is not a city of one crisis, but a city with two layers of reality. On one side are new housing areas and districts growing from Miami's spillover. On the other, older neighborhoods have high density, stronger economic pressure, and more visible social challenges. Crime in this city is also uneven. Some areas remain relatively stable, while certain areas show higher incident levels than nearby suburban averages. On Florida's east coast, Titusville sits along the Indian River Lagoon, directly across from one of the world's most iconic technology centers, Kennedy Space Center. Titusville is a city living under the shadow of two sharply different worlds. On one side, there is an economy still connected to the aerospace industry and Space Coast activity. On the other, many parts of the city show signs of long-term economic stagnation. Median household income is in the $50,000 range, but the distribution is uneven, and several older neighborhoods remain at far lower income levels. Economic pressure here does not always appear as a major crisis, but more as a slow decline. Jobs that do not grow as quickly as other parts of Brevard County, older homes that have seen little revitalization, and commercial areas that are not as active as Florida coastal cities with heavier tourism. Along Florida's Space Coast, Cocoa sits near the river routes and not far from the Atlantic Beach, giving the city a strategic position. But a strategic location does not always mean economic stability. Cocoa is a classic example of a coastal city with uneven growth. In numbers, median household income is around $63,000. But like many cities in Florida, this average hides the gap between different areas. In certain parts of the city, you can see traces of an economy that has not risen along with development around it. Older homes, less maintained neighborhood streets, and local economic activity that depends more on low-wage service jobs. On Florida's Gulf Coast, Port Richey looks like a quiet small town on the map. But behind that calm, Port Richey is one of the clearest examples of a coastal town that never fully recovered after long-term economic change. Economically, median household income is around $51,000, with some areas around the city showing pressure above the regional average. Many residents work in service, retail, or day labor jobs across the Tampa Bay area, types of work whose stability depends heavily on the local economic cycle. Along Palm Beach County, Lake Worth Beach looks like one of Florida's coastal towns with the most living character. But behind that aesthetic, Lake Worth Beach is also known as one of the clearest small-scale examples of coastal inequality, visible in a very geographic way. Economically, median household income is in the $61,000 range, but this number does not describe conditions that are truly uniform. In several blocks, especially closer to the city's older area, pockets of low income remain in the middle of gentrification and rising living costs in Palm Beach County. What makes Lake Worth Beach interesting is how economic change does not happen evenly. Daytona Beach is known across America as one of Florida's most iconic coastal towns. What often puts Daytona Beach in discussions about problem coastal towns is not one single factor, but the concentration of challenges in certain urban areas. In some older parts of the city, away from the stronger tourist zones, social pressure is more visible: cheaper housing, lower incomes, and economic activity that does not match the busy beachfront districts. Crime in Daytona Beach is also discussed more often than in many other Florida coastal towns. This does not mean the whole city is dangerous, but the pattern shows inequality between areas, where tourist zones and older residential neighborhoods have very different social dynamics. Panama City on Florida's Gulf Coast has two very different faces, depending on where you look from. On one side, the city is a regional hub with access to the Gulf of Mexico beaches, the tourism industry, and the economic roots of the Florida Panhandle. But on the other side, it is also known as one of the coastal cities most affected by long-term instability from major hurricanes and uneven development. One of the biggest turning points in the city's modern history was Hurricane Michael in 2018, which hit the region with major impacts on housing, infrastructure, and the local economy. Since then, Panama City has recovered, but the process has not been even, and that is what shapes its social and economic condition today. On South Florida's Atlantic coast, Riviera Beach is often not as well known as its more glamorous neighbors in Palm Beach County. But that is exactly what makes it relevant in the context of coastal inequality. The city sits only a few minutes from extremely wealthy areas, yet within its own limits, there are economic pockets that remain far behind. Economically, median household income is in the $68,000 range, which is lower than many coastal cities in Palm Beach County. But this average does not fully capture the reality on the ground, because income distribution in Riviera Beach is highly uneven between neighborhoods. Crime in Riviera Beach is also often discussed in a regional context, not because the entire city is dangerous, but because some areas have higher incident levels than nearby suburban coastal communities. Fort Pierce on the Treasure Coast often looks like a classic Florida coastal town. Economically, its median household income is around $47,000, placing it below many other coastal cities in Florida. In some areas, especially those farther from the waterfront zone and downtown Revitalization, economic conditions feel heavier, with older housing, limited job opportunities, and dependence on service sector and low-wage work. Fort Pierce is also known for a clear contrast between areas being revitalized and areas left behind. The waterfront and some parts of downtown have started improving through investment and new development, but not every neighborhood is rising at the same pace. Mexico Beach on the Gulf of Mexico coast is one of the clearest examples of a Florida coastal town highly vulnerable to natural disasters. The town is small, quiet, and visually feels like a classic Florida beach community, with low-rise homes and a shoreline directly open to the Gulf. But its modern identity can hardly be separated from one major event, Hurricane Michael in 2018. That storm hit the town with severe impact, damaging infrastructure, destroying many homes, and changing the city's landscape in a short time. Since then, Mexico Beach has been in a long phase of rebuilding and recovery, and that process has not happened evenly across the entire area. Economically, median household income is around $63,000, but this number is highly unstable because the town's economy is small and heavily dependent on seasonal tourism and rebuilding activity. Carrabelle on Florida's Gulf Coast is one of the small coastal towns that feels like old Florida, still surviving in the middle of changing times. The city is not large, not dense, and not driven by a major tourism industry like many other beach towns in Florida. It is more like a coastal community living at a slow rhythm with a limited economy. Its economic structure is very simple: small-scale fishing, local service jobs, and a little seasonal tourism. There is no major economic engine truly pushing long-term growth. What places Carrabelle in the context of worst coastal towns is not high crime, but consistent economic stagnation. Many parts of the city look like they have barely changed for years. Port St. Joe on Florida's Gulf Coast is one of those coastal towns that looks calm from the outside. Nearby Gulf of Mexico water, a small town atmosphere, and a pace of life far from the noise of major cities. But behind that calm, the city carries a long story of economic change, shifting from an industrial past to an era more dependent on tourism and local services. What makes Port St. Joe relevant in the context of coastal worst towns is not that the city is in crisis, but that its economy is narrow and recovery has not always been even. Some parts of the city are beginning to grow again through new investment and interest in coastal living, but not every area is moving at the same speed. Port St. Joe also sits in a region vulnerable to tropical storms, adding another layer of risk for Gulf Coast communities. Cedar Key on Florida's Gulf Coast is not an ordinary coastal town. It is a cluster of small islands that feels far removed from modern Florida's rhythm. There is no skyline, no major urban growth, only a small community living between the sea, fishing, and highly seasonal tourism. The town's main activity relies on seafood, especially oysters, small-scale fishing, and local tourism. When the tourist season slows down or sea conditions change, the town's economy slows down with it. What makes Cedar Key relevant in the context of worst coastal towns is not crime or social disorder, but its structural vulnerability as a small island community. Limited access, a small land area, and dependence on only one or two economic sectors make the town highly sensitive to outside changes, whether shifts in the marine environment or fluctuations in tourism. Apalachicola is a real example of a coastal town that depends heavily on one economic source, and when that source weakens, the whole town slows down. In the past, Apalachicola was widely known for its strong oyster industry. The estuary ecosystem in this area made it one of the most important seafood centers on the Gulf Coast. But in recent decades, declining seafood harvests, environmental change, and regulatory and ecological pressure have made this industry far weaker than before. The impact is felt directly in the local economy. Economically, median household income is around $35,000 to $40,000, with limited job opportunities outside fishing and small-scale tourism. Many residents depend on seasonal work or small businesses that are strongly affected by natural conditions and tourist flow.